All right, it is up and running. Time to get down to work. So this afternoon, we're going to be looking at one of the major life cycles that a person is likely to go through in life, which are weddings and divorces. Now, it might be a little strange to talk about divorces while also talking about weddings. A lot of people, think it's maybe bad luck to talk about this, or I don't even want to think about it. But in Judaism, it is very important that we have both parts. According to Jewish law, whenever you sanctify something, there are ways in some situations that you can unsanctify that thing. And that is what a divorce is. It takes the relationship that had been made as a unique, holy connection, and it dissolves that connection so that the two people are free to pursue other connections. And wedding without divorce is prison. That means that you are trapped in a relationship with no possibility of an exit. And Judaism believes very strongly that there needs to be always an exit. Doesn't mean you should take it easily. It doesn't mean that a person should bolt at the first sign of difficulty, and we'll talk about that when we get to divorces. But it does mean that there needs to be an exit in order for the wedding itself to be entered into with a full heart and optimism. You have to know you can escape before you can be willing to trust. Make sense? Okay, so let's go through how this works. Well, Mishnah Torah, this is, again, taken from the works of Rambam, Maimonides, 1,000 years ago, one of the best codifiers of Jewish law. And before the giving of the Torah, that means we're talking now, 3,000-ish years ago. Before the giving of the Torah, it would be that if a man happened upon a woman in the marketplace and they wanted to marry each other, he would bring her into his house and consummate the marriage between them privately. Consummate means, of course, having sex. And she would be his wife. Done, right? Walking down the street, hey, I like you. I like you. Want to go home? Sure. All right, we're married. That was the old style of doing things. Once the Torah was given, meaning once Sinai happened, once we have our new laws, covenant, Israel was commanded that if a man wanted to marry a woman, he would acquire her first through witnesses, and afterwards she would be his wife. As it says, when a man takes a woman and sleeps with her, meaning that there has to be some level of acquiring, of taking. It's with consent of both parties. It's not like caveman taking. That when this happens, it is then followed by being together. You don't reverse the two, right? You don't get married by sleeping together just because you feel like it. You have to do some sort of ceremony to make this be marked as a deed. Make sense so far? Okay. So nowadays, meaning 2019, we have two main sections for a wedding. We have Erusin, which can also be known as Kiddushin, and then Nisuin. And these two sections used to be separate all the way up until the Middle Ages, depending upon which community you lived in. But now we do them back to back under the chuppah, under the wedding canopy. We'll look at the details of each, but the short way to remember them is that the Erusin, the initial part, is marked by the giving of a ring, and the second half is marked by the 7 blessings. We'll go over both of those sections in more detail. We also use, and have for the last 2,000 plus years, something called a ketubah, or ketubah, depending upon how you want to pronounce it. A ketubah, which was presented, accepted, and witnessed before the ceremony, is technically a promissory note ensuring financial security for the bride should the couple divorce or the husband die. Those of you who are taking my Mishnah class right now, we are going through all sorts of details about the topic of marriage and ketubah and all of the different financial obligations that can go along with it. So you can get a lot more detail over in that video. But the idea was that you needed to have this promise, this additional guarantee for a woman, because she was leaving her family's home and joining his home. That was the standard practice in the ancient world. And that meant she was financially vulnerable. She didn't bring usually much property of her own. And because, as we'll talk about with divorce, he could just divorce her when he felt like it, that could leave her then completely alone with no financial means of support and the ketubah was meant to prevent that even if he divorced her, she would still have a stipend that would be enough for her to survive for some time. Does that make sense? Okay. Bedekin. Also, in a modern ceremony, we do a pre-ceremony act of veiling the bride, and this is known as the bedekin. You may remember in the story of Rivka lowering her veil and Chaya Sarah in order to avoid Yaakov and also to avoid Yaakov's blunder with Leah, the groom will himself lower the veil. So the whole don't see the bride before she walks down the aisle thing, we do the ketubah signing. We also do the bedekin, the veiling, before the walking down the aisle stuff ever happens. So you're definitely going to be seeing each other before you walk into the chuppah and do that part of the ceremony. And that's a very important part, right? One, Rivka lowering her veil when she is jumping off the camel to meet Isaac for the first time is a sign of modesty and such. But the more important one is that Jacob, when he wanted to marry Rachel and was tricked into marrying Leah, that never would have happened if he had looked under the veil and seen the face of the person he was marrying. And so we've learned and continued for 3,000 years to always check who it is we are marrying, just to make sure that we're getting the right sister. Good? Good. Circling. If you have seen a Jewish wedding in a movie or on a TV show, you might have seen this. If you've been to a Jewish wedding, you might have seen this. This is a tradition. Tradition, again, means that this is not a law. This is not even a mandatory custom, as some customs have become. This is a tradition found in different communities and done in different ways. What you will often see is that the bride will come to the where the chuppah is, right before that, and the groom will stand, and the bride will circle him. Customarily, 7 times, right? So she'll walk around him 7 times. There are arguments in different communities about whether it should be clockwise or counterclockwise. I actually know a couple families in San Diego when I was growing up that got into a big fight over which way to do it because the bride's family said this and the groom's family said that, and they were really quite angry when they couldn't agree. This is seen by many people as the idea that the bride is leaving her family's home and she is now entering into his sphere of influence, into his orbit. Obviously, many people do not see that as being very egalitarian. So another interpretation, and most likely the older interpretation, is that what she is doing is meant to throw off any evil spirits, that this was a folk custom. This was nothing about Jewish law or Jewish belief, but it's what people end up believing, the same way that people will believe all sorts of stuff about spirits and ghosts and pixies and whatever. And the idea would be that by circling, she was confusing the spirits. They would, she'd throw them off the trail. So that way she would not bring any bad luck with her into the new home. Your mileage may vary. Most of us do not follow this practice in the conservative movement. If someone wants to, I certainly do not stop them. And there are other ways to reinterpret it, as I mentioned, from either references to Jeremiah, where it says the woman is the one who encompasses and protects the man, which puts her more in a position of authority and strength, or referring back to the Battle of Jericho, where the walking around was the prelude for knocking down the walls. So you can interpret it in new ways if it's an important custom that your family would like to hold on to, but by no means is this required. And if you get married without circling, you're still married. Any questions on that?
So in the conservative movement, it's not required?
It's definitely not required. Definitely not required. We will allow it, but it is not required. Erusin. Now we get down to business, right? This is where the wedding actually becomes a legal act. The ketubah technically could be merely a custom and allowed to go. However, I will tell you this, there is no conservative or Orthodox rabbi that will let someone get married without a written ketubah. But in the ancient world, sometimes people would slip through the cracks. Nowadays, it's not going to happen. But the erusin part is where the formal part of the marriage takes place. And it's quick. If the rabbi did not stop and explain and give little interpretations or teachings, this would be over in about a minute. The whole Jewish ceremony could be done in about 5 minutes if everything is laid up and ready to go before you start. Usually weddings take a little bit longer because people feel silly if their wedding is over in 5 minutes. So what happens during this? Well, this is the official betrothal. Betrothal is the fancy word for engagement, but I use it rather than the modern word for engagement because in the modern American culture, at least, engagement is basically like saying, I super want you to be my girlfriend, boyfriend, and we're probably going to get married sometime. That was not what betrothal meant in the biblical time. It's not what betrothal means under the chuppah, under the wedding canopy. Betrothal in our community means that you are getting married-ish, that you have moved yourself from being single to being obligated to this other person, but you haven't finished that and moved to the next step, which allows you to then live together as husband and wife. So it is like a super engagement. Little interesting historical note, in Western cultures, it used to be felt that way as well. And in fact, if you were engaged to someone and then broke off the wedding, they could take you to court for breach of promise. That was like breaking a contract. So it used to be taken more seriously now as well, more seriously than now in the Western society as well, but people have gotten a little bit more relaxed about it. We still take it seriously, but don't worry, we don't let this engagement last. Like I said, by another 20 minutes, the marriage will be done. So it's not like you have a long engagement. Good so far?
Is it always like that, or sometimes it takes longer?
So there are occasional circumstances where it can sometimes still be delayed. So I know of one couple that this is before I became a rabbi, where there was a difficulty with, they were going to be separated for an extended period of time. And they weren't going to be able to have the wedding before he had to leave. And so they did erusin, and then he went overseas. And then when he came back, they did the rest of the nisuin, they did the rest of the marriage as well. So this allowed them to feel married, and it allowed them to also do some government paperwork, because that was important for her to be recognized as his wife by the U.S. government, for whatever might happen while he was overseas. But it also let them then do the real wedding, final big party celebration when he got back. So sometimes, yes, we can still use this as a separate event if there are special circumstances, but I've only seen it once now in my entire life where it's been done that way.
So if these young people that they are really love and they want to get married, but they don't have, like, they still working on the sources to build the house or have it ready to move together.
Right.
So they want to do the engagement or the everything, and then like before when we were doing in the mission in a year, then get the celebration and everything, but don't live together until that day. I
do not recommend it.
Okay.
Right. So yes, it's technically possible, but because once you've gone through this, you would need a divorce if you choose to separate. And if you fool around, it's considered full adultery. It opens up too many possible problems. It is much better to just say, we're working towards getting married and having our house together, and you're saving and I'm saving and doing whatever else we're doing. And we'll get married on this day, and it's going to be a year from now. Fine to make all of those arrangements, but best not to do erusin and then wait. It's best to just wait for 100% of the ceremony and do that all at the end of your preparation time. It just avoids complications.
Yeah, it's very common these days that you see people that they get engaged and then a year, 2 years after is when they.
And that's fine. I mean,
but they live together, so it's not like.
that's less recommended. We'll come back to the whole concept, if you remind me before we're done, about premarital intimacy. We'll come back to that. But let's finish doing the standard version before we talk about the non-standard versions. Okay, so erusin takes place. Now, how does erusin work? Well, erusin comes with a blessing. This blessing is said over a cup of wine, of course, because we always have wine as a symbol of sweetness during any of these events. And the blessing that we say for erusin is You are blessed, Lord our God, the sovereign of the world, who has sanctified us with your commandments. So far, that should sound very familiar. And given us commandments concerning forbidden relations, and has forbidden us unto those who are merely betrothed, and permitted us unto those lawfully married to us through chuppah and kiddushin. Now, that's basically saying you're not allowed to get married to your sister or your brother or someone else that is. You're not allowed to get married to someone who's already married to someone else, right? So that you know that when you are making these declarations, the person you're marrying has to be a valid person to get married, and that just because you've done this blessing doesn't mean you get to go off and do the hanky-panky. You still need to have the chuppah, the kiddushin. You still need to have the conclusion of the ceremony before that happens. Again, that part of the blessing is not as relevant today because we do put those two sections of the service together. But in the ancient world, that was a bigger concern, that they might fool around before we had finished actually getting the ceremony done. You are blessed, Lord our God, who sanctifies your people Israel through chuppah and kiddushin. Again, a reminder that the full sanctification only happens at the end. Make sense? Okay. By the way, this, as well as the next phrase that we're going to talk about, which is how the ring happens, is one of the reasons why, in at least the conservative and Orthodox world, we can't do a wedding between a Jewish person and a non-Jewish person. Because the idea is that a Jewish wedding is with people who are sanctified by the commandments, right? That we are under the jurisdiction of Torah, right? The same way that as an American citizen, I'm under American jurisdiction. If I was Canadian, I'd be under Canadian jurisdiction. And so if I get married, I have to get married according to American laws. If I was Canadian, I have to get married according to Canadian laws. And in this circumstance, that means that if the law doesn't apply to you, then the ceremony is non-binding to you. If I, for example, happen to be visiting a church and they're doing some sort of ceremony in the church, it doesn't apply to me because I'm not Christian. So too the jurisdiction, the reach of Jewish law ends at Jewish people. It simply cannot affect anybody who isn't Jewish, and that's a good thing. All right? We don't want rabbis going around making people who aren't Jewish keep kosher. We don't want rabbis going around making people who aren't Jewish keeping Shabbat. It's not our jurisdiction. It's not their obligation. And likewise, we can't impose our wedding laws upon them. If they want to be bound by our laws, then, well, they convert. They become Jewish, and then, yes, you are 100% bound by laws, and no problem. The wedding is now between two Jewish people, maybe one born, one who converted, but they're two equal Jewish people, and therefore the law applies to both of them. Does that make sense? That's going to be even clearer on the next page, where the groom has to present the bride with a ring as an act of this betrothal. Judaism loves words. We also like actions. And in the ancient world, the ring was the symbol of giving a gift to show one's intention. Right? This was not meant to be a bribe. This was not meant to be a purchase. You'll notice the ring goes to her. It doesn't go to her family. Right? I'm not buying the girl from the family. I am showing her that, yes, I am committed to you this much. And it may look a little mercantile, but as a symbol of I will be able to support you because I'm able to provide this, it was important. The actual amount was not that important. The ring couldn't have stones, and we didn't want her to have a mistake of what it was, because most of us can't look at a diamond and say, oh yes, that's worth $3,000. Most of us don't have those skills. It did have to be worth at least a pruta. A pruta was like a penny in the ancient world coinage. So it meant you couldn't get married by a cigar band or a rolled up, chewing gum wrapper that was all shiny. It does need to have some value, but as long as she is willing to accept whatever it is, then that's good enough. So it doesn't have to be fancy. It just has to be acceptable to her. Does that make sense? Okay. As Rambam said, the giving of a ring or other monetary gift is only one of three ways to initiate betrothal. Right? Technically, there are other ways to get married. The second is with a document that states the same as the groom will say, behold, you are consecrated, ... We're going to go over that in a second. And the third is intercourse, which is coupled with the same phrase, which, yes, would be a very interesting, intimate scene. Behold, you are consecrated to me by this act of intimacy. It's not exactly the usual lines of foreplay, but technically that would then constitute a marriage. However, the sages said, don't. All right, we don't get married by having sex with this formula, and it's also not become common to do it with only a piece of paper. I think that's fairly clear that most of us would prefer to have a more substantial token of commitment than just having written something else on a document. The second one, the document would technically still be valid, but we strongly discourage to the point of forbidding people from getting married with sex only. Right? Make sense? Okay. Now, you may have noticed that so far I'm only talking about him giving her a ring, but you may have also noticed that in most modern ceremonies, she will give him a ring. And this is important. In the ancient world, it had to be very clear that what he was giving was entirely his and for the purpose of a gift, not that he was trading her for something else. Right? If I give you this and you give me that, it can look like we just made a barter. We just made an exchange. At which point, the gift of the ring was no longer a gift. It is now just a purchase price for whatever you're giving me, not for the binding of our relationship. So in the ancient world, a woman would not give anything back to the husband at this point. In the modern world, where women have their own resources, their own ability to be economically independent, it made sense for most communities for the woman to also give him something. Now, many Orthodox communities, they still don't allow the woman to give anything back, lest it give the wrong impression, but many modern Orthodox do. And in any event, in many communities, even if she doesn't give him something under the chuppah, he will still be given a ring later that he will then wear as a sign of being married afterwards. So the wedding ring for a man is still common in most communities, even if it's not given under the chuppah. Nowadays, I usually just make sure when we do a two-ring ceremony that I explain very clearly to both of them, as well as to everybody gathered, that she is giving her own gift to him, that this is not meant to be taken as an exchange or a swap. So that way it's clear and transparent. Good. Okay. See how easy it is to get married? Nisuin, right? The second half of the marriage process. Actually, hold on a second. Did I put that out of order? I did. All right. So for some reason, one of my slides disappeared. All right, so as I mentioned, there's a phrase that the husband says when he offers the token, and that phrase is "Harei at mikudeshet li." Behold, you are consecrated to me, b'taba'at zo, by this ring, kidat Moshe v'Yisrael, according to the laws of Moses and Israel. We have him say that both in the Hebrew as well as in English, so that way everybody is clear what he is saying. And that is the basic idea that if you accept this, then you accept that we will be consecrated to each other, and that consecration, that marriage, will be done according to the laws of Torah, the laws of Moses, and the laws of Israel, the laws of the Jewish people. And that those parts are going to come back even more when we get to divorce in extreme circumstances. But like I said, again, only somebody who is bound by the laws of Moses and Israel then can be bound by this declaration, which again is why we don't do interfaith marriages. I should point out, just in case you're interested to know, if someone has married someone who isn't Jewish and they would like to still be part of a Jewish community, our community and most other conservative communities do still welcome them, and we will educate their children and help them participate to the fullest extent possible. But officiating at the ceremony, we simply lack the power, we lack the jurisdiction to be able to officiate over someone who isn't actually Jewish. It's not always the distinction that couples are looking to hear when they come and ask if I'll perform a wedding, but there are limits to my power. Now, nisuin, the second part of the marriage process. This is often delayed just a little bit, so we can see that there are two ceremonies. Often the ketubah or parts of the ketubah will be read. Often the rabbi will do a little speech or talk to the couple at this point. But this is a little pause. But nisuin itself, the main core part of it, not counting any other embellishments, are what we call the 7 blessings, the Sheva Brachot. And those are the focus. We do also say other blessings or other words of encouragement, but the main legal part that's happening here are these 7 blessings. It can be said by the officiant, or it can be said by other honored guests. As long as they're said, we're good. So what are these blessings? Well, they are beautiful. Well, the first one you should recognize. Blessed are you, Adonai, sovereign of the world, creator of the fruit of the vine. Borei peri hagafen. It's what we say over wine anytime you drink it. You'll hear it especially, of course, on Friday night or Saturday morning when we're also doing the Kiddush for Shabbat or for a holiday. Then, same opening. Blessed are you, Adonai, sovereign of the world, who created everything for his glory. The idea being that the created form of this world, as we're going to see, which involves the way humans are made, that this is a glorious thing, right? Human beings and all of the messiness that goes along with being human isn't a mistake, that this is a beautiful thing, and that this is something that should make us appreciate the wonder of God even more. And when we stand at a wedding, we are focusing on this even more sharply, because we say God is also the creator of humanity. Right? So all of the world is amazing. The human slice of the world is also amazing. We're not mistakes. We're not messed up. We're not defective. Because we know that God made us in God's image, in the pattern of his own likeness, and provided for the perpetuation of his kind. Right? This is part of this interesting little miracle that comes from being a human animal, which is we have the ability to make more human animals. That's kind of cool. I know we take it for granted because we see birds and bees doing that too, but it is kind of a miracle that there is this self-replicating life in the universe. We haven't come across this anywhere else except the planet Earth so far. And so it's clearly not just the normal way, right? Rocks don't make more rocks just by banging together. They make gravel, but they don't make new rocks that go on and have their own life. And so this is something that we are especially impressed by. You are blessed, Lord, the creator of man. I should point out that man in this context is talking about humanity, not just about one gender. And then we start moving into the specific joy that comes from marriage. Let the barren city be jubilantly happy and joyful at her joyous reunion with her children. Blessed are you, Adonai, who makes Zion rejoice with her children. Wedding is always considered to be the happiest moment in a person's life. It is considered to be the chief joy that a person will experience. And therefore, we all see this as being the template, a metaphor for what happiness should be for everyone. And so when we see the joy of a bride and groom, we recognize, no matter what's going on in the world, the joy that the world can and should be experiencing. So this bright moment is something that we really treasure during this moment of the marriage. We good on these 5? Okay, because the last 2 get a little longer. We don't get the same opening yet, but then we have this reference again back to creation. Let the loving couple be very happy, just as you made your creation happy in the Garden of Eden so long ago. Blessed are you, Adonai, who makes the bridegroom and bride happy. You'll notice we refer back to the Garden of Eden with joy, right? The happiness of the Garden of Eden, of them being the only 2 people in the world for each other. That is how the husband and wife should look at each other, right? You're the only person in the world for me, and vice versa, the other direction. Just as at the beginning, there were only the 2 for each other. You'll also notice that we say that God makes the bridegroom and the bride happy, meaning that each of them is sharing their own separate joy at this particular moment. But as we'll see at the bottom of the last blessing, this happens where at the end, their joy is being increased because they are happy together, right? Happy separate, happy in their union. Make sense? Well, let's work through blessing number 7. Again, same opening. Blessed is the one who created joy and celebration, bridegroom and bride, rejoicing, jubilation, pleasure and delight, love and brotherhood, peace and friendship. That's quite a list, but it's also a list of what a marriage is meant to be. I know we talked about all of the money stuff, and we talked about the ring stuff, and we talked about, we're going to talk about divorce, and it can all seem very dry and practical and not even all that exciting. But hopefully you can see from this blessing, as well as the other 6, that we're really, really happy to have a wedding. And we want there to be love and joy and all of this partnership between the two. This is the ideal. Yes, it may have also had economic needs, and there may have also been social pressures, and there may also be cultural things that could limit the way they would choose who they were going to be with. But ultimately, we want a relationship that is going to be amazing. And the best relationship a person can ever hope to have is the relationship they have with their spouse. That is where you have an opportunity to see another human being most clearly and most deeply compared to any other relation that you might have. And therefore, we are experiencing with that relationship all of the varied forms of positive connections that God has made available to us. Does that make sense? Good. And now that we see them happy, we're thinking about general happiness. As you'll notice, Judaism likes talking about our own stuff, but we also like to turn that outward for the rest of the community and world too. And so we go to, may there soon be heard Adonai our God in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem, the sound of joy, the sound of celebration. And what is the best sound of joy and celebration? The voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride. The happy shouting of the bridegrooms from their weddings and of young men from their feasts of song. Blessed are you, Adonai, who makes the bridegroom and the bride rejoice together. Right, so this idea of the whole city should be alive with celebration because of this, and that is a model. Indeed, it's a model taken from the words of the prophets of what final redemption will sound like. If you want to have a taste of what joy the world will experience, go to a good wedding. That will give you an idea of what the world will experience when redemption finally comes to everyone. Just don't go to the bad ones. Okay. Everybody knows, of course, that at the end of a Jewish wedding, we break a glass, right? Why do we do this? There are lots of explanations that are given post hoc, meaning after the custom was invented, many additional layers of meaning have been taught, and those are fine. Not going to take away from that at all. However, there is an original glass breaking story. It's not like we don't know where this came from. There is a discussion in the Talmud of the breaking of a glass, except it didn't exactly happen the way we do it now. They used to break, the original glass breaking story was during the party, where the rabbi was sitting there and watching everybody happy and rejoicing, and he realized people were getting a little too happy, right? Their joy meter had been turned all the way up to 10, and they were losing sight of the world. And so what he did was he broke a expensive glass dish, and everyone went, "Ah!" In the same way that if you're in like a very loud party and someone drops a dish and it breaks on the floor, suddenly the whole room is silent and everybody turns around. And that was his attempt to just put it to 9, right? 10 is a little too much. 9, right? The world is not ready for 10 yet. Because as happy as you are, there is a world outside that door. And that world out there, it isn't perfect, right? There are still lots of problems. So we cannot personally be at 10 if the world is still at like negative 40. Even on my wedding day, I can't be at 10 if the world is that bad. So we dial it back to 9. We're not going to be like miserable. We're not going to say, oh yeah, I got married, but the world is terrible. We are going to be happy. We are going to dance. We are going to laugh. We are going to have this great time. Just dial it back a touch. And indeed, that is why we do that stamp and smash. Other traditions talk about, biological, the opening up of the womb, if you will, in the case of a virgin. Other people talk about superstition in terms of driving away evil spirits with loud sounds. And a homiletical, people have interpreted this to mean any number of 1,000 different things to try and explain it. But I think the original explanation is right, that union of husband and wife should be the most joyous occasion, but it should not make them ignore the rest of the world. Even as they stare into each other's eyes, they still need to also see past their own joyous union and recognize the rest of the world needs a little help. And hopefully with them together, they'll be a help to the rest of the world. And that togetherness is what we do first. There is what we call yichud. It comes from the word echad, which means one, and it's the word for being together. And the bride and the groom have time alone right after the ceremony. I don't know if you've ever been to weddings, but sometimes most of the time, if they're not doing this, the bride and the groom are swept into the cocktail hour, or they're swept out to do photos, or they're out greeting guests, or doing something other than being together, just the two of them. And Judaism said, no, 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 no. After you've been married, you need to go, be in a room, just the two of you, be together for the first time. I mean, you may have obviously been, hanging out together before this, but you weren't married before this. So you just go and have that moment of peace, that moment of quiet, that moment of reflection of what it means to be now that you are actually married. And this is, I find, one of the most powerful parts of the ceremony. And it really does make a difference. And I've been at weddings where I wasn't officiating, where other people don't do this. And you can see the poor bride and groom just get swept from the chuppah right into all those celebration. And they don't stop, running until everything at the end of the day is done. And then it's like, wait, we're married. It catches up to them sometime around 1 a.m. Let it catch up a little earlier. And then, of course, there is a reception. There is always a reception. It's in fact known as a seudah mitzvah. It is a feast of a commandment. If you fulfill a commandment, that is a joyous occasion, we always have a feast. Now, obviously, it doesn't have to be $1,000 per person kind of feast, but there should always be some form of celebratory reception after the wedding so that people can feel the joy, and indeed they can gladden the bride and the groom. It is considered to be a commandment that the rest of the community make the bride and groom happy on their day of getting married. And so you'll see people doing all sorts of stunts. If you've ever seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, you'll know the bottle dancers and stuff like that. Right? That was all about trying to just make them smile and laugh as it was their day of being together. So having that celebration is a big deal. It's okay to have it be low key, but definitely make sure there is some time for laughter and singing and all of that good stuff. We're good? Yeah. We like good parties in Judaism. But sometimes even the best people who try their best can't quite make the relationship work. There's all sorts of reasons why it might happen, but just sometimes it doesn't work. So what happens? Well, the book of Deuteronomy itself tells us that if a man takes your wife and possesses her, again, this has nothing to do with like the English usage of the word possession, like any sort of ownership or anything like that, because a man can't sell his wife, but he marries her in the language, the idiom of the Bible, and she fails to please him because he finds something obnoxious about her, and he writes her a sefer kritut. That's literally a document of separation, or a divorce document in the modern terms. He hands it to her and sends her away from his house. She leaves his household, becomes the wife of another man. Then this later man rejects her, writes her a sefer kritut, writes her the document of divorce, hands it to her and sends her away from his house. Or the man who married her last dies and she becomes a widow. Then the first husband who divorced her shall not take her to wife again, since she has been defiled, for that would be abhorrent to Adonai. Now, getting remarried is not defilement in the sense like, ooh, you got remarried. The question here is, you got divorced from one guy, married someone else. If you came back to the first guy, then that would be kind of problematic, because wouldn't that mean I could just like divorce my wife, let her go off with some guy for the weekend, he would divorce her after the weekend, and then I could remarry her? It's like wife swapping, but legal. It would allow adultery to happen just with the signing of a few pieces of paper and trading, partners. Judaism is not okay with that. And so therefore, if she remarries, she can't go back to the first husband. So I'm sorry for Elizabeth Taylor. That doesn't work under Judaism. She got married to the same guy twice, with a few people in between. She was a bigger deal when I was growing up. Anyway, I realize I'm talking to a younger audience that probably has never even seen an Elizabeth Taylor movie. Another time. So there is nothing wrong with marrying a divorcee. And in fact, we have all sorts of things that we do to try and make sure that she still does have a great celebration. But you don't want to marry the woman you divorced if she married someone else. You can marry your own divorced wife back again if she hasn't been married to someone else in the meantime. So, make sense? Okay, it's a pretty rare circumstance, but it explains more about this whole idea of Judaism doesn't actually look down on divorce, but there are some limits. Oh, she's probably here for the 7 o'clock meeting, which is a little early. Was that who texted me? I didn't even think. No, that wasn't her. Okay, so obnoxious, because it said that the man would divorce her if something was obnoxious. What does obnoxious mean? Debate in our rabbinic literature, in this case, the Mishnah. Beit Shammai said, well, no man shall divorce his wife unless he found in her unchaste behavior. That is their definition of obnoxious, as it is stated in Deuteronomy, because he found in her ervat devar, which they're translating to mean unchaste behavior. Beit Hillel says, even if she spoiled his food, because it is said ervat devar. They read the problem that he finds in her to mean that she could have done anything wrong, right? You don't need a special cause. It's not like she had to be fooling around. It's not like she was, doing something horrible. It's just he's decided he doesn't want to be married to her anymore for any reason. Rabbi Akiva, a later person, says, even if he found another woman prettier than her, as it is stated, it happens that she does not find favor in his eyes. So what this is saying is not that these are reasons you should divorce your wife, but this is saying the court can't stop you from divorcing your wife. So if you go to the court and say, yeah, I want to divorce my wife because I saw this really cute girl and I want to marry her, the court will say, okay. Right? Doesn't mean that the court's going to say, great job, man, wonderful choice, that's a great decision. No, but they can't stop you from divorcing for any of these reasons. Clear? Right? Again, not recommending, but not preventing. So what happens is there needs to be a document, what we call the Sefer Kritut in the Book of Deuteronomy, later becomes called a get in Jewish slang, Jewish lingo, which has caused no end of jokes about you have to get a get and things like that. But that is the term that we use, and it just doesn't work so well in English. So the get has to be handwritten. It has to be handwritten for the purpose of this specific couple. So a ketubah can be a printed form where the rabbi fills in the blanks. A get cannot. A get has to be written by someone who is trained precisely to write a get and to make sure that there are no errors. Now, why? Because if you make a mistake, then the divorce didn't actually happen. And then if the people marry someone else, it's adultery. Right? Getting people married, that's easy. Because getting people together, there are plenty of options for that. Getting them divorced means you have to do it precisely because you're taking that holiness that they've built together and you are untangling it so that way they can be with other people. And if you don't untangle it completely, then when they're with other people, it's the same as if they were still married. So we take divorce documents very, very seriously. I have not studied enough yet to be a sofer for this purpose, to be a scribe for doing this. My handwriting is also not good enough. But that means that I have to always commission a get to be written on behalf of a couple if they're getting divorced. And there's a rabbi that I use that I know has this down very, very well. Because I won't do this yet either until I have learned all of the ins and outs. And there are special courses to take to make sure that there are no mistakes, because you don't want to mess up with this. As Deuteronomy says, the process begins with the husband, because that's how Deuteronomy describes it. But if there is cause, a wife can petition the Beit Din to convince him for a divorce. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But I just want to bring you up to speed in the modern world. In the modern world, a woman can initiate divorce in a civil court. And if the civil court allows the divorce, then every Jewish community agrees that the husband should then ratify the civil divorce and also grant her the religious Jewish divorce, should also give her a get. So in the modern society, because of the civil court system, it means a woman can initiate the process much more easily than it had been in the historical time. Clear? Okay. So what do we do if he doesn't want to give a get, right? Either historically or in the modern world? Well, historically, there was a little bit of a problem, right? Because a get is given under compulsion. You don't want him to be forced to give a get, right? If she has her brother go beat him up until he writes the document, that's invalid. The same way that if I have somebody beat up somebody to sell me their car, that's not considered a legal sale either. However, if the court forces him, and it included a little bit of roughing up in the old days, that was considered acceptable if the court was the one in charge of it. If non-Jews did it, that was considered invalid because we didn't want non-Jewish people pressuring Jewish people to do divorces. However, among the non-Jewish court, they may beat him and say, do what the Jewish court is telling you. That was considered valid. This gives you some idea of what the relationship was between Jewish courts and non-Jewish courts throughout the Middle Ages. So a Jewish court could hand him over to a non-Jewish court, and the non-Jewish court could rough him up, saying, do what the Jewish court told you to do and give your wife that divorce. That was one of the ways we used to solve this. Other ways it would be solved would be to say, if you don't give a divorce, no one will do business with you. If you don't do divorce, no one will speak with you. And these were social pressures that would often convince a husband to indeed give the divorce. Because sometimes you'd get husbands who had stopped living with their wife, stopped supporting her, but refused to give her a divorce so she wasn't able to go remarry. In those circumstances, we called such a woman an aguna, or in plural, agunot, which literally means that they are chained. It's like they've got an anchor attached to them, but they can't escape from this guy because they haven't been given a proper divorce. They haven't been given their get. And this was one of the ways, and the other pressures I mentioned were other ways that we could convince the husband to do what he was supposed to do. Make sense? Okay. Before I jump into the other solution that we have, let me explain what has happened over the last 150 years. As we've talked about before, Enlightenment happens, Jews are emancipated, kinda, and that means Jewish courts don't really get to rough people up anymore, right? If I was to take a husband into my office and to talk to him, I would go to jail, right? So I don't have that lever anymore. If I tell him, no one in this congregation will do business with you anymore, he's probably going to say, okay, so, right? I can buy food at Publix. I don't have to buy from the congregants. I can take care of my job without ever talking to anyone from this synagogue ever again. So who cares? The same thing if I said, no one will talk to you. You'll never have another aliyah in my shul again. Who cares? He's able to walk away. All of the traditional levers that we used to have to convince husbands to give the get are gone. And in the modern world where he can get a civil divorce without giving the get, then even more so, the woman can be left behind. And this has become more of a problem now since we lack those controls. As I mentioned earlier, since the woman can't initiate the divorce proceeding herself and she can't write the get, it means that it is usually the woman who is in a particularly vulnerable position in these cases. It is true that a woman can refuse to receive a get, and that can cause a little slowdown in the process of the divorce religiously, but there are more traditional ways of getting around that problem. There aren't really that many traditional ways of getting around the problem of him refusing to give the get, because traditionally we had solutions to that problem too, right? It involved a little coercion. So what has happened in the modern world is the conservative movement has looked into this and said, you know what, you're lucky, because there is a way we can take care of this, and it is something that was talked about in the Talmud. So let me walk you through it. It's called Hafka'at Kiddushin, which literally means the uprooting or the annulment of Kiddushin, of the marriage. So this is talking about how you do a retroactive annulment of a Jewish marriage, meaning that by the time we're done, they were never married. Doesn't matter if they were husband and wife for 40 years, by the time we're done, they were never husband and wife. It's a little time-traveling power of law. So how does it work? Well, Rav Nachman said that there's this case where the husband would give a get, but before it arrived at his wife, he would go to another court and he would say, I void the get. I retract it. And then he would send a get, and then he'd go to the court and say, I retract the get again. So he's basically yanking the chain. He keeps acting like he's going to send it, but then he cancels it when it's en route. And this is obnoxious. And so Rav Nachman is saying this is a problem, right? Because he could annul this get in front of two people, right? Go to two guys and say, hey guys, you're my witnesses. I officially cancel the get. He could do that. But since two people do not generate public awareness, it's possible that the wife doesn't hear about this. Right? She doesn't know that he canceled the get. So she gets the document from the delivery guy, and she thinks, good, I'm finally divorced. And so she goes out, she marries, that's considered adultery, and she has children. Those are considered what are called mamzerim. In Jewish law, if a child is born from a forbidden union, adultery or incest are the two most likely, that is what we call a mamzer. Being born out of wedlock is not such an issue, right? That's not like the European concept of the bastard. It's only if you're born from an actually forbidden union. So this is one place where if, for example, two people have sex and they have a child before they get married, provided that they are okay for each other, right? They're not like brother and sister and they're not married to other people, then there's no stigma attached to this at all. No great honor. You don't, get that on your name tag. Hello, I was born before my parents got married. But it's not the same stigma that was attached in Europe for somebody who was born before marriage took place. So he's worried that there won't be enough public knowledge that this voiding happened. And so he's going to propose a solution. Well, they're all going to propose the same solution, but that's what his problem is. Rav Sheshet says, well, maybe he'll void it in front of three, and that means there will be public awareness. So she does hear about the fact that he voided it, but now she won't marry. So he sent the get, she gets it, but then she hears he canceled it, and now she's stuck. She's got a get that is invalid. How does she get another one that will be valid? She's now stuck being unable to marry because he is playing games. And so therefore, there will be these deserted wives, and we need to fix that solution. So how do we fix it? Well, if he rendered it void, if he does this anyway, even though the rabbis have now said nobody is allowed to annul their get before when they send it, if he does it anyway, technically it is still canceled, right? Because I can say all I want, don't do this, but someone can still do it. And so it would still be void. So what does Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel say? He says he is unable to render it void. Even though technically, legally, it would be void, it's impossible to be void, and he cannot add on it his condition. He can't add other special phrases. Because if he could, if so, what is the power of the court, right? How can you say the court has any authority if he's just allowed to ignore the court's wishes? So instead, they will annul the marriage. Why? Because the Gemara asks, the Talmud asks, but wait a minute, is there anything that the Torah renders as a valid get that due to what is the power of the court, you're going to say isn't, and you'll allow the woman to just get married? Yes, that's exactly what the Talmud is saying. That yes, according to the Torah, it is true that he nullified this get and therefore she should not be allowed to get married. But we, the court, are going to kind of sort of overrule that, not by saying the Torah is wrong, but by pulling out the whole marriage altogether, right? So what happens is when anybody gets married, when anyone who weds, a woman weds her upon the condition of the will of the sages. Remember, Kedat Moshe veYisrael. I'm getting married to you according to the law of Moses and Israel. Guess what Israel is? The rabbis. Right? You're getting married according to the law, but you're also getting married according to the authority of the community. And that means that if you can fail to conform to their will in matters of marriage and divorce, the sages can uproot the marriage retroactively. All right, so what happens is in the modern world, in the conservative movement, if a man is saying, oh yeah, I divorced her, but I'm not going to give her a get because she cares about Judaism, but I don't, and I hate her, blah, 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 blah. We contact him. We say, look, please reconsider this. He says, no, I don't want to do it. We say, we'll pay for it. No, I don't want to do it. I want her to suffer, blah, blah, blah. Once we establish that indeed he will never, under any circumstances, give her the get, then we gather that evidence. We have a special court that we convene in New York among all of the leading rabbis in our movement, and we go through the process of Hav Kedoshin, of uprooting the marriage. and now it is like they have never been married at all. And remember, since our definition of bastards has nothing to do with being born out of wedlock, the children who are now technically born when they weren't married, because we just went back and erased their marriage, there's no problem, right? There's no stigma, there's no damage done to them, and she is now free, and we don't have to talk to him again. So this is the technique that is used only in the most extreme circumstances. But it is important because, as I said at the very beginning, there has to be a door. Amber alert. Okay. Not on the road, so unfortunately I can't see any of the license plates, but check when you guys leave, if you get the notice as well. There has to be an exit. There has to be a door. And in the modern world, one of our tools for helping there to always be that door was taken away, so we use another tool from our tradition. For most of the last 2,000 years, no one ever needed to use this. But thankfully, our sages discussed the theory, and so it is legally in our books, and now we can, under extreme circumstances, use it to make sure that just as people can come together, they can also be separated. Any questions? Okay. I know it's kind of a downer, but you got to have both sides to make everything work right. Okay. See you all next week.
Thank you.
Well, hopefully I'll see you at Shabbat with you.
Yeah.